Thank you for the reminder. Um, uh, and I'm so happy to be able to do that. The good thing is that about going on being the presenter on the last day is that I get to build on the amazing content that my colleagues have shared with you on Tuesday and Wednesday. The bad thing about being the third person is that they did such a spectacular job that the bar is really high. So I'm not quite sure what I'm going to share with you that they haven't already told you, but hopefully we're going to spend a great morning together. We're going till noon, just for those of you that like to schedule like I do. And like many of the children with whom okay, you're also, if you're able to start closed captioning. If you tell me how to do that, Cassie, I know there is a way to do it, but I don't remember.
So it should be down on the bottom there with all of your options. If it's a setting that we enabled. If not, then that's okay. We can also
Let's try this.
later. Oh, there you go.
Okay, there you go.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thanks for the reminders. And so you can see it takes a team, and that's great. It's always wonderful to have colleagues that have your back when you need it, and that's the important. That's important. But one of the things I think about, and that I think about for my own learning, and when I think about how we are working with children and students, and just a little disclosure. I use the word children and students interchangeably, and I'm talking about the work, the material I'm covering today really works across the age span, and it depends on how you apply it. So it depends on content and material and curriculum. So, but I think that the principles apply to students across the age span. So that's something to think about. And also today, I would so love it and so invite you to either just chat, say something, ask us a question, give a comment, or put something in the chat. Because just like we tell our students, if you have a question, someone else has a question. And, that's the perfect learning opportunity. So when you have the question, if you rather wait till the end, that's fine too, but feel free to jump in. So let me tell you, I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to move you folks back over here. Okay, wait a minute. Okay, there we go. Oops, and I went too far, although that drink looks fabulous. Okay, let me tell you a little bit about myself, and then we'll get going. And again, feel free to jump in with questions or anything, any comments or disagreements. I love it when people disagree because that gives us opportunity to learn more about each other. So like I said, my name is Eileen Schwartz. I'm a faculty member in special education. I've been at the University of Washington. It hurts me to say this, since 1991. And I've been working with students with autism since 1978 when I was in college. And, the thing that I think about when I think about working with students with autism, and all students, is on one hand, how much we've learned, how much the field has changed. So when I first started working with children with autism, the prevalence of autism was 3 to 5 in 10,000, and now it's 1 in 54. So obviously the field, what we're dealing with is different. But on the other hand, how much it stayed the same. Children are still children. Families are still families. Individuality is still individuality. Intersectionality is still intersectionality. Now we have a name for it, but we know that when children and families enter our schools, or whatever settings we work with them in, that they're bringing all their different identities, including race, ethnicity, beliefs, gender, ability, and all of that makes up the individual. So um, that's what makes it exciting and challenging to work with children and students and families. So I always say to my students when I'm talking to them, I wish I could, if there was a formula to say, if you do this, every child in your classroom will be successful, I would share that formula with you. Unfortunately, there is no such formula, but there are processes that we can that we can use to try to unpack what we can do to help make children and families successful. So, again, we're meeting remotely, and probably today it's good that we're meeting remotely so that we're not out adding to the carbon footprint and making things hotter than it is. But I hope that maybe next summer we'll be able to meet together and share a lovely beverage like this. Of course, I've never gone to a workshop where I get a beverage like this, but maybe someday I'll be able to do that. But I'm looking forward to being able to sit down in a coffee shop with a friend and share a beverage like this. So make sure this is your time to make sure that you are hydrated and fed and do everything that you need to be comfortable. So like I said, we're so happy that you're here. Um, um, we want to know who is here. So if you could share in the chat just some things about you, like you have been in the last few days. So your name, if you're representing a school district, which school district it is, if you're a parent, what school district your child attends school in, your role. So SLP, parent, teacher, and then your favorite summertime treat, which there are so many for me. I can't even begin to think about them. Although one of my very favorite summertime treat is fresh peaches. I really love fresh peaches. And so that's something I look forward to every summer. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. I do want to comment that I can't see the chat right now, Rena Marie and Cassie. So if questions come up in the chat that I should be aware of, thank you. I know that you guys have my back. You folks have my back. So let me let me first tell you what our objectives are for this morning. What I want to do is talk about the relationship between SEL and function of behavior. So all of us, or most of us, are probably familiar with the idea of function of behavior that comes from positive behavior support. And in fact, in the 30 odd years that I've been working in special education, I would argue that this idea of thinking about the function of behavior is probably the biggest change in the field that we've seen. So we're going to talk about that and understand its relationship with SEL and how they're really interdependent and interrelated, as opposed to just a new shiny object or new educational initiative that we need to think about. We're going to talk about what those basic functions of behavior are. And I know for many of you that's going to be review, but it's always good to review that stuff. We're going to talk about some strategies for how to think about using database decisions in classrooms. We're going to talk about antecedent strategies. We're going to talk about some distant social setting events. So what does that mean for the child and family? And this is, I think, especially important as we're all coming out of the pandemic. And then thinking about strategies for teaching students how to engage in new behaviors. So we'll go ahead and get started. So one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot in the last 2 days, and listening to Rena Marie and Cassie talk with us about uh, social emotional learning and just the really core the core importance of social emotional learning, and how social emotional learning is really fundamental to everything that we do. I've been thinking about how do we make sure that social emotional learning gets integrated into what we already do, as opposed to being a new shiny object that we pay attention to for 6 months until we get bored with that initiative and move on to a new bright shiny object. And one of the ways that I like to think about that is by using the pyramid that we most often now think about with MTSS or PBIS, or we at the Herring Center, we have a system that we call building blocks that again is the same idea. But this idea of a pyramid really comes from public health. And the idea of the pyramid is that the bottom tier is universal. And when we think about the bottom tier, well, all the tiers, one of the things about the tiers is another way to describe them, rather than saying tier one, tier two, tier three, or primary, secondary, and tertiary, is all, some, few. So the idea of tier one, or what we see in the green here in our pyramid, is the idea that all students, all learners, regardless of background or ability, receive that instruction or receive that content. And then the secondary, or some, is part of that is the idea of saying, what supports, accommodations, modifications can we put in place to make sure that students are accessing that content? And then the few may be the specially designed instruction that some students may need, but again, to get the content, the same content. So I always want to think about how we um, how we embed, integrate, um, teach self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, relationship skills, and responsible decision making in that, as part of that universal um, instruction, the tier one that all students receive. So as we talk today, I'm going to try really hard, and hopefully we can all be thinking about this together, in how when we think about antecedents, when we think about skills that we need to teach, that we can be thinking about those core SEL competencies, rather than something separate, but something that's woven into the fabric of things that we're already doing. Okay. So we know that challenging behavior has a function, and I actually don't like to look at that slide, because that picture just makes me sad. So I'm going to go back to this one. But um, but we know that challenging behavior serves a function, that challenging behavior is communicative, and that communication is power. So when we think about what communication is my ability to change your behavior by doing something. So when a toddler raises their arms and I pick them up, um, that toddler has changed my behavior in what we call a socially appropriate, by exhibiting a socially appropriate behavior. They've lifted my arms and they've basically requested, up please. Okay. When a child with a disability turns a table over, they have basically requested, I need something different than what you're giving me now. But they're doing it by engaging in what we call a non-socially appropriate behavior. But the function of both of those is the same, that the child is engaging in a behavior because they want to communicate something to the people in the environment, the adults, their caregivers, perhaps the other children in the classroom. And what we know is that when children engage in challenging behavior, they're communicating. And what we're trying to figure out as the teachers and caregivers is, what are they communicating? how can we help them achieve the function, and how can we help them achieve that function in a more appropriate way? Now, as I started to say a little bit ago, I think that the biggest change I've seen in the field of special education and behavior analysis in the last 30 years is this idea of thinking about the fact that challenging behavior serves a function. In the bad old days, we used to think that challenging behavior, we still said it was challenging, but we said, okay, that's a behavior, we need to get rid of it. What can we do to get rid of it? But now we say that's a behavior that serves a function. We need to understand what the child is trying to communicate, what motivates and maintains that behavior, and we need to get rid of it. Okay. And these are challenging behaviors, not, I want to be very clear, especially for any of you that work with children with autism. I am not saying, and I would never say that I want someone to some people have criticized behavior analysts, especially about saying we want children with disabilities to, and people with autism to act less autistic or to act like they have less like they have a disability. That's not what I'm saying. I want children and students and adults, whomever, to have the best possible quality of life and to learn the skills and behaviors that they need in order to be successful in doing what they want to do. Okay. And what that means then is that if I walk into a room and it's too loud, I need to be able to say to someone, it's really loud in here. I need help. And whether that's turn down the TV, turn off the music, give me some headphones, all of those accomplish that function. Having the tantrum doesn't accomplish that function. So we want to think about what, or it doesn't accomplish the function and allow you to stay in the setting. Okay. So when we talk about the role of the behavior, I want to remember, we call that in special education and in behavior analysis, we talk about the function of the behavior. And that's what we're going to talk about now. So before we get there, okay, I'm just going to go to the chat really quickly and see if there are any questions or, okay. 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 And so any questions before we move on? Just feel free to speak up. Okay, hearing none, I'm going to go ahead. You know, you give a faculty member um, a PowerPoint and I can just go crazy. So, okay. So when we talk about a function of behavior, we're trying to figure out what motivates and maintains that behavior. So behavior is lawful. It doesn't just happen for the heck of it. We know that behavior happens because something in the environment is maintaining that behavior. And so, so for example, I gave you the example of the child holding up their arms, and that and the parent picking them up when they hold up their arms maintains that behavior. So that happens both for appropriate behaviors and inappropriate behaviors. Okay, so I always think about, I usually use this example with reinforcement, but my husband thinks he's quite the comedian. And so when he tells a joke and people laugh, what is maintaining that behavior? Well, attention. And he will tell that joke again if he gets attention, even if it's like people groan. And so something we may not think of as positive attention, he still will tell that joke again. If he tells that joke and people actually walk away, he doesn't tell that joke again because it's not getting him, it's not the function that he needs is not being met. Okay. So when we think about the function of behavior, we're really trying to figure out what's maintaining that behavior, what's motivating and maintaining that behavior. Now, there are four main types of functions that we talk about, and we have this nice acronym SEAT to think about them. The first one is sensory, and sensory behavior is things like our vestibular system. So we know that some people will rock and it seems to calm them down. So I feel dysregulated, or there's just too much going. I feel like there's too much going on. So I rock and that seems to calm me down. Now, again, that's not just people with disabilities, because if it was, we would not sell rocking chairs in our society, and rocking chairs are very popular. So, rocking is a function that is something that we all like. Okay. Again, this doesn't just apply to people with disabilities. This applies to all of us. Another example of a sensory behavior is issues with lighting. I know that there are some kids who have a really hard time in different kinds of lighting situations. And again, when we think about how do we help that child be successful in a situation where the lighting is hard for them, there are two ways to approach that challenge. We can say, okay, we're going to change the lighting for this one child. Not really very optimal for that child because it limits where he or she can go. Or we can say, okay, you can wear a visor, because that visor, or baseball cap, because that might block the light that's bothering you. Okay, so we can make an accommodation around that. So sensory, we think about heat, movement, light, sometimes taste. Heat, like this is going to be a challenging weekend for many kids because it's going to be super hot, and that's a sensory issue. Okay, the second function that we talk about is escape. And escape is basically, I want to get away from that demand. Okay, so I my brother-in-law is 74 years old. He and he has some undiagnosed disabilities. He was a blue baby at birth, so he has some neurological issues. Um, but um, but he was never diagnosed with a disability. But whenever you bring up an issue that he needs to address, that's challenging for him, he begins and immediately to tell you about some pain he has somewhere in his body. So he's using that to escape the discussion of a behavior that he doesn't want to engage in. Okay, so that's his escape behavior. Escape means you're trying to get out of a challenging situation. So it might be doing a math worksheet. I give you a math worksheet, you tear it up. Okay. I ask you to do a puzzle that you've done 13 times in the past week, and you throw it at me. You say it's time to do journal writing, and I actually have a really hard time with writing, but I don't want to admit that in front of my peers. And all of a sudden, I have a stomach ache. Or I engage in off-task behavior, or I start telling jokes so that I'm disruptive to the classroom. Those are all examples of escape behavior. But the idea there is I'm trying to not have to engage in the demand in the situation that we're talking about right now. The third the third function of behavior is what is attention. So what someone's trying to get attention. So baby lifts their arms, they're trying to get mom's attention. I want a drink of water, or I want my mom's talking on the phone and I want her to attend to me instead. And all of a sudden I need a drink of water. My crayon is broken. I can't work my tablet. The dog is bothering me. Those are all forms that I'm trying to get attention. And then the last one is tangible. And sometimes, what's motivating the behavior is I want something. You have the tablet and I want the tablet, or you have the train that I really want, or you're sitting in my spot if you're Sheldon Cooper in The Big Bang Theory. So I think there are two main things that I want you to remember about these functions. First is that when we talk about the function of behavior, we're not just talking about people with disabilities. This is a behavioral universal law, and it applies to all people. Like, we can think about our own behavior, and what we do to get attention, what we do around sensory, and we could come up with some pretty interesting um, uh, items to share with each other. But that might be a little TMI this early in the morning, so we won't do that. The other thing that I think is really super important about um, the function of behavior, and when we think about that, is the fact that it applies to both positive and negative, and what we consider positive and negative behaviors, or appropriate and what societally we call inappropriate or challenging behaviors. This is not a theory that only applies to appropriate to challenging behaviors. Um, okay. For some reason, my Siri on my phone just got activated, and now it's probably trying to look up challenging behaviors. So who knows where it will be. Okay, so when we think about behavior, it's important for us to think about the form versus the function of behavior. So this is a little dive into behavior analysis, but again, those of you who are special ed teachers, I'm sure you're really familiar with this. But we want to make a distinction between what a behavior looks like and what the behavior is, what function the behavior serves, because we can sometimes get tricked by what the form of the behavior is, what it looks like, and what the purpose of the behavior is from the perspective of the student. Okay. We always need to focus on the function of the behavior and figure out what the child is trying to communicate. Now, as I've just said, that we want to really focus in on function, we're all about the function here. It is important, however, to think about the form. The reason it's important to think about the form is so that I can describe the behavior to other members of my team, other members of the educational team, so that when we are thinking and working on behavior, that we are all on the same page about what the behavior may look like. Okay, so and that is when we talk about defining a behavior, so that we can all measure it the same way. Okay, so yesterday, when you're talking about the core the core competencies in SEL, and you talk about self-management as one of them, we need to know what self-management looks like, so that we can say, yeah, that's it. So we can be teaching it, we can reinforce it when we see it, and if we're not seeing it, we can change our instruction so that we're more likely to see it. Okay, so here's an example when I was talking about the the function of behavior. Here's an example that kind of makes is a little confusing to look at, but I think it's nice to kind of look at um, and kind of in a big picture way. Okay, so when I think about functions of behavior, we talked about the four main ones: sensory, escape, tangible, attention, and tangible. But another way to think about it is to say there are two big buckets here. And one bucket is that we're trying to obtain something that's desirable. Okay. And that could be, you think about attention, tangible, sensory, those can all be under things we're trying to obtain. And then we can also think about sometimes there are things that we're trying to avoid, and that can be undesirable events. Okay. Now, within both of these, so first we say, okay, is a child trying to obtain something or is a child trying to avoid something? And then I want to say, is that social or non social? Because again, this is going to allow me to pinpoint more directly the information about the function. So, for example, if I have a student who's trying to obtain a desirable event and it's non social, it could be all of these sensory issues. So, I could be trying to obtain some rocking. I could be trying to obtain an endorphin release. I could be trying to obtain visual stimulation. Um, any of us that, have children who kind of look weirdly into the light and do weird stuff, kind of manipulate the eye, or they really love flashing lights, they're trying to get some visual stimulation. They're engaging in a behavior that's to try to obtain something that's desirable to them. It's non-social, it's sensory. Okay. They can also be trying to obtain a desirable event that's social, and it can be an attention, such as smiles, hugs, frowns, because that can also function as a reinforcer. Or it can be an object. It can be social, but it could be food, money, a preferred activity, um, uh, you know, um, having someone read to them, whatever. Now, so here's an example. I worked with a little boy, and he was in a school district. He was in kindergarten, and he did the behavior that is guaranteed to get you attention if you're in a public school. He pulled the fire alarm, so which is a big, yeah. I see that face. Number one, you will always get attention if you as a child pull a fire alarm. So it was a big deal, and the principal marched him into his office and gave him such a lecture, finger wagging in his face. It was the stern lecture. And the next day, the child did the same thing. Okay, because he got a whole bunch of attention for engaging in that behavior. Okay. So we have to remember that when we're talking about the function of behavior, we need to think about it on how the child perceives it. So this frown and scolding, that's still attention from the child's point of view. Okay. Now, again, we said the child behavior can be functions of behavior can be thrown into these two big pots. They can be obtain, or they can avoid. So if we think about avoiding undesired events, we have non-social behavior. So we want to avoid sinus pain or skin irritation or hunger. So for example, I've been having some knee pain, a little TMI, too early in the morning. So I've been trying to remember to take some ibuprofen every morning because I want to avoid knee pain. Okay. So again, I'm trying to avoid an undesirable behavior. It's not social, and that's in reinforcing this behavior of mine of taking ibuprofen. And okay, we can also have try to avoid social behaviors. So they can be attention. I don't know how many of you ever. I remember growing up, we had when Aunt Lil came over, all the kids ran away to hide from her because she would pinch our cheeks really hard. And so when Aunt Lil came over, we always tried to avoid Aunt Lil. Didn't often work, but that was that. But we tried to avoid her attention. Okay. So some people, we want to avoid their attention. Some children, it's having someone hug them or tickle them is not pleasurable to them. They want to avoid that. for some things, other things we might want to avoid, we might want to avoid difficult tasks. Okay, it's too hard. Math is too hard for me, so I'm always going to get a stomach ache at math. Or it's too hard for me, and so I don't want to admit that, so I'm just going to tear up my math paper. Um, uh, I want to avoid an interruption of a desired behavior. So I might learn to say 5 more minutes when mom says it's time to clean up. 5 more minutes, please. And I've learned that to avoid the change, the interruption of a desired activity. Okay, so the idea of this kind of complicated slide here is to say that function of behavior is not always easy to figure out. And sometimes we say it's undetermined, we don't know. But we're going to do a couple examples here to see. I thought I had more examples than that, but that's okay. To see what it looks like. Okay. So, so we're going to talk about for a minute. I need to just go ahead here because okay. So, so why is it, okay. Why is it important to identify the function of behavior? So, oops. Okay. Why is it important to identify the function of behavior? Sorry about that. Because it's research-based, it's an evidence-based practice, but more importantly, is it gives us an objective way to study behavior. So as long as we're just saying, if we don't objectify the way we study behavior, then we get into a position where we're using a lot of words and practices that can be judgmental. And we come up with explanatory fictions about behaviors that are not always helpful in trying to solve the situation, to address the situation that we're dealing with. The other thing that we know is that when we understand the function of behavior, we are able to identify an appropriate intervention much more effectively than if we don't know the function of behavior. So, for example, if I have a child who hits to escape completing an activity, so I have a child who engages in aggression to escape an activity, and I say, okay, in my classroom, if you hit, you go into timeout. Well, what does timeout do? It removes you from the activity. So if my goal is to escape this activity, you're reinforcing it. I might as well be handing the child, to use a stereotype, a handful of M&Ms. You're saying, okay, you don't want to do this. You hit me, and now you don't have to do it. What's going to happen is the likelihood is that the child will increase their frequency of hitting. Now, if I have a child who hits and I've done my homework, I've done my functional analysis, my functional behavior assessment, and I know that the child hits to escape completing an activity, and the child is redirected to stay in the activity and receives help so that they are successful with that activity, then the challenging behavior, the hitting, is not reinforced. Okay. Now, if I just say, okay, I know this child is trying to escape math, so I'm not going to let him escape math. But I don't teach them how to be successful at math, then I'm just going to have a lot of people who are really unhappy. The child will be unhappy, the teacher will be unhappy, and nothing will probably change. Because the reason that we try to escape things in most cases is because they're hard for us. We don't like them. We feel unsuccessful with them. And so this is a good time when we go back to those core competencies in in uh, social emotional learning and think about, well, why is it that math is hard for me? Why is that? What's makes it hard? Is it using my pencil that's hard? So is the writing hard? Is it that the task itself is too hard? I don't know. I don't understand about carrying. I'm not expecting the child to figure that out, but I'm expecting the teacher to help figure that out and say, how do I, you know, how do I integrate that into thinking about what function this behavior may be serving? So now, we're going to do some functions. The reason I was looking at this so oddly before is that the form of some of my slides got changed. And so see, form and function can be important. So, okay, I want you to read this. Oh, okay. No, we already did that slide. Okay. So now we're going to do some testing, okay, which we all love, pop quizzes. So I want you to read these and I'm going to put up a poll. So we're playing a game called Let's Guess the Function. So a child raises their hand and the teacher calls on them. A child makes a face at the teacher when she calls the child's name and everyone else laughs. So this is, we're starting out easy. So what function is this? Okay. I'm going to give people about 15 more seconds to answer. Okay. So you folks are very good. You're very good students because most everyone said that this was attention. Okay. So yeah, when a child, and again, there are examples here of when of a positive behavior. Okay. So the child wants attention. They know how to get attention. They raise their hand. The child wants attention. They also know how to get attention by making a face and having and getting peer attention. One's getting peer attention. One's getting adult attention. Okay, we're going to go on to the next one. Okay. Okay, let's see. Okay. Okay, so can you see the poll right now? Yes, okay. Okay, so here's the next function. So child asks their parents for ice cream and the parents give it to them. And child screams when the teacher takes away her the blocks that she is playing with. So what's the function there? And again, I'll give you about a few more seconds to take care of this one.
My poll is not working.
Oh no, I'm sorry. Okay, just you can put yours in the chat. Is that okay?
Thank you.
Yeah, sorry about that. I would tell you I would try to fix it, but I have no idea how to do that. So I would be lying if I said that. Okay, so let's I'm going to share the results with this one. This one is a little trickier. The answer is tangible because so the child asks the parents for something and they get it. She gets it, right? And then this other one, the second one is a child screams when the teacher is trying to take away the blocks. So she's screaming to basically say, no, thank you. Don't take away those blocks. I'm still playing with them. And so it's still tangible, but you can see that, some people think it's sensory, some people think it's attention, and some people think it's undetermined. So, if you think it's undetermined, then you have to collect more data. That's the answer to being undetermined. The answer for, if you think it, what we're doing by determining the function of behavior is we're trying to develop a hypothesis. And when we develop the hypothesis, then we're going to go forward with setting up a treatment based on that hypothesis. Now, the new thing that we're going to do based on the information we have today is we're going to really be thinking of, or because of this workshop that we're in right now, is we're really going to be thinking about, when we develop the treatment, how do we incorporate core components of SEL, and how do we incorporate the big setting event that we're all living in right now, which is coming back from a year, 16 months or more of trauma. Okay. And so those are things that we need to incorporate in this. Okay. So I'm going to stop sharing this. I'm going to relaunch it, continue. I'm going to put this over here. Okay. Okay. So here's another one. The child throws the crayons and paper on the floor when asked to color. The child refuses to point to the object when asked. The child hands the teacher a break card and goes to sit in a beanbag chair at the end of a classroom activity for 5 minutes before returning to that activity. You folks are very good at this. I'm going to give people a few more seconds to answer. Okay. So again, you folks are super good at this. Most people said escape. And I would say that this is escape, that basically the child is given a task, whether that task is coloring or pointing, and they're asking to, and they're engaging in a behavior to avoid that task. Now, the bottom example is the desired behavior. That's exactly what we want to see someone do, is that if you need when something gets really hard, you take a break, and basically you take a break so that you can collect yourself. In fact, this is again a little TMI, but this morning I was walking my dog and I saw some folks who live up the street get into a husband and wife have this kind of giant argument, and then the wife just walked away, and she was taking a break. She was just taking a break. She needed to remove herself from the situation, and she just took a break and walked away. And I was like, okay, hi. Leanne and I are just walking by here. So but again, this is the behavior that we want children to learn how to do, right? We want them to say, I need a break now. A break does not mean that you get to sit down and engage in your favorite activity. A break means that you get to sit down and not have any demands for a few minutes. And I know I've had that situation too, where I'm in a tense meeting with someone, and someone says something that is really hard for me. And sometimes I just have to close my eyes and take a deep breath. That's the same kind of thing. Okay, let's see where we are now. I think we're done with this. This next one is a repeat because I didn't um okay. Um okay, we already talked about that. Okay. So we're going to take a break, and it's 10:23, and we're going to take a 10-minute break. So we'll come back at actually, let's come back at 10:35. Okay, we'll come back at 10:35, and I will see you then. Okay, I'm going to pause the recording. The recording. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, well, welcome back. I hope everyone is hydrated and happy and hungry for this information. So we'll get going. So, and again, we're talking about why it's important to determine the function. And I just think it's so, I can't say this enough times, and I know I've already said it once, but I'll say it again. Um, I do believe that the most significant change in special education and behavior analysis in the past 30 years is understanding that behavior serves a function and that behavior is communicative. And so, in the same way that if I ask you a question about what time it is, and you say, today is Wednesday or today is Thursday, um, that that doesn't help me, right? It's true, yes, it is Thursday, but knowing it's Thursday doesn't answer my question. It doesn't serve the function that I'm trying to achieve with my behavior of asking you that question. So, in the same way that if we're trying to help a child or help a student learn the most appropriate way to get their to meet the function of their behavior, get their need met, we need to understand what that need is, and so that's why it's so essential for us to understand the function of a behavior before we start thinking about an intervention. So I like to think about a process because, I like a process. I'm that kind of linear kind of gal. I like to think about a process about how we address challenging behaviors. And this is a process that we go through as a team or as a family, or, we can do it as an individual, but I always think the more the merrier, because we do better thinking when there's more than one of us. But the reason it's important, I think this strategy is important, or this process is important, is that it allows us to be systematic when we do this. Now, one of the reasons I believe it's so important for us to be systematic is about challenging behavior, especially, is that it is hard when you're dealing with a student who's engaging with challenging behavior. It is hard to remember that the behavior is not about you, um, and that our goal is to help the child be successful. And the more systematic and scientific we can be about it, the what that allows us to do is to realize that the behavior may be challenging and bad, but the person is still an important, loving, incredible human being who's part of our class and community. Okay. Behavior we have to get rid of, the student we need to embrace. And the more systematic we can be, I think the easier it is to do that. So I think there are 7 primary steps that you need to go through when you're thinking about addressing challenging behavior. And the first is identify the behavior. And I know that sounds kind of silly. People say, well, of course I know what the behavior is. Well, sometimes we don't know what the behavior is, because sometimes someone will say to me, this child is driving me nuts. That's lovely, but it's not a behavior. I mean, I'm sorry to hear that, but that's not a behavior. What is the behavior we're looking at? Is it um, is it trying to leave the classroom? Is it not finishing their work? Is it uh, tearing up materials? Is it aggression? We need to know what the behavior is. And there are a couple reasons that we need to know that. One is so that we assess the correct behavior, but the other is that we're going to be developing data. We're collecting data about the behavior, and we need to define the behavior with enough specificity that Rena Marie and Cassie and I can all watch the behavior, all observe the child and count the same behavior. Because otherwise, we're not going to be able to evaluate the effectiveness of our interventions. So once we identify the behavior, the next thing we need to do is assess the behavior. And when we assess the behavior, we want to think about when the behavior occurs, and I think more importantly, when the behavior does not occur. Knowing when the child does not engage in a challenging behavior is extremely helpful in thinking about understanding the function of a behavior and potential interventions that can be helpful in that behavior. And we'll get into how to get this information in a minute. So don't worry, we'll get there. We want to think about why is a student engaging in this behavior? What's the function? And then especially, what are the unseen setting events? So I have a colleague who has a son with autism who's pretty severely impacted by his autism. And she used to have what she called the yellow clip intervention. Because if he had a bad night or a bad day, a bad morning, he would come to school, he would go to school, and she knew he was going to have a really rough day. So lack of sleep was highly correlated with a challenging day at school the next day. So what she used to do is on the days where he had a hard day, she'd put a yellow clip on his backpack, and the teachers would see that yellow clip, and they had developed a yellow clip day schedule so that there were fewer demands. There were still demands, but there were fewer demands. There were more supports. So in order to help him have a successful day, even though there were a lot of unseen setting events in place. Now, we are in a place where there are so many unseen setting events going on. Housing insecurity, food insecurity, parents who may have all kinds of other issues going on. So many people have experienced huge loss in the last year. All of those things impact our behavior, and we need to acknowledge that they have an effect on people's behavior. However, we can't control them, right? I can't control that a family has food insecurity. Now, on my end, I can support that student by making sure that they have a meal when they get to school, and that they have a good meal at lunchtime, and that I can send that child home with a food bag on Fridays so that they can eat over the weekends. But I can't control the food insecurity. But I can be sure that I incorporate that into my assessment. Okay. And so, when I go and listen to, the more I learn about trauma-informed care, one of the things that I hear people talking about is that you need to do that assessment, but the treatment is still coming up with a comprehensive way to support the child and family. So not acknowledging that a child is engaging in challenging behavior isn't helping that child. It's kind of passing the football down the line, because especially for those of us that are dealing with younger children, the more we can address some of those behaviors when children are younger, the more successful they're going to be moving forward. One of the reasons for that, there's lots of reasons. We can talk about brain plasticity. We can talk about all those kinds of things. I like to talk about it as your learning history. So, if we have a behavior that's been reinforced for 4 years, it's hard to change. Well, that same behavior has been reinforced for 8 years, it's even harder to change. So the earlier we can start students with good habits and teaching them the right way to get attention, the right way to get help when they run into a difficult situation, the right way to deal with a conflict, those are all those social emotional learning competencies that we've talked about in the last 2 days. And then the last part of the assessment, of course, is how often the behavior occurs. And we'll talk about that in a minute. So the third step is developing a hypothesis about function. Then we need to, and so, is it, again, SEAT, sensory, escape, attention, tangible, or undetermined. Sometimes it is undetermined, but hopefully you won't run into that, because that's the hardest one to deal with. Changing the antecedent. So what skills can we put in place? And this is where we're teaching those good social emotional learning competencies. How am I going to teach this child to self-manage, to be self-aware, to engage in better relationships? We'll talk about that in a minute. Okay, so antecedents are what happens before the behavior. Change the consequences. That's what happens after the behavior. Measure. So is what I'm doing successful? Because if it's not successful, I don't want to continue it. And then reflect on the process. Okay. Oh, that's what made me nervous. Oops. Okay. Sorry. So when we do that's what we call the way we understand or we attempt to learn about the function of a behavior is we do what's called a functional behavior assessment. Now, again, I know that most of you are probably familiar with a functional behavior assessment because it's required in the IEP process. So a functional behavior assessment is something that defines the target behaviors. It determines environmental effects that can contribute to the challenging behavior, and that can be seen and unseen. So what's happening on the child's, ride to school, at home, biological issues, those are all things that we want to think about. We want to think about the antecedents and consequences, that occur and maybe impacting the challenging behavior. We want to hypothesize the function, and then it provides direction for both teaching appropriate replacement behaviors and effective positive interventions. So let me just talk for a minute about what a replacement behavior is. So a replacement behavior is the behavior the child's engaging in now may be ripping up their math paper. And a replacement behavior may be maybe what do we want the child to do instead of that can help them achieve the same function, ideally. So if they're ripping up their math behavior because it's too hard for them, then what we may teach them to do is to ask for help. And we may also say that that they can do math at a different time. We may change the kind of math behavior they have, the kind of demonstration around math that they do. So that's where our good universal design for learning comes in. We have to think about what's the math objective we're trying to teach, and is there a different way that this child can demonstrate that they're learning that objective? Is the objective we're trying to teach just too hard? And do we need to change that? There are all kinds of things that we can do. Is it that the actual penmanship handwriting is so hard for them that they can do the work, but they have a hard time writing the numbers down, and so can they use a keyboard or a scribe? This is when we get to be really good detectives and come up with good solutions. So when most an FBA often um, uh, has a couple ways of collecting information. One is interview, another is direct observation, another is checklist. So when we do interviews, here are some of the kinds of questions that we want to think about. One question is, what does the behavior look like? What do you, as the teacher, parent, paraprofessional, behavior analyst, whoever's working with the child most, sometimes it's great to ask siblings if they're involved. If we're working with older students, we can sometimes ask them, why do you do this behavior? It's good to have a student perspective. What do you think the function is? What events and situations predict the behavior? When is this behavior more likely to happen? It always happens during math class. It never happens during reading. It always happens when there's a lot of transition going on. It never happens when the child is alone. So we want to think about that. We need to know, what are the child's preferences? How do they like to learn? What do they like? How do they like to sit? What are things that function as a reinforcer for them? What are preferred activities? Do they like to work with headphones? Do they not like to work with headphones? All those kind of things. We also want to make sure that we know how the child communicates. And I would argue that, although this is, not the topic of this of this workshop, but if the student does not have a functional communication system, you need to do that before you do anything else. So a functional communication system is a system where the child can express their wants and needs and protest appropriately. So if I can't express those basic functions, then the only way that I have to tell you I don't like this is to engage in challenging behavior, because I don't have other ways to communicate that with you. So if the child does not have a functional communication system, before you do anything else, you need to work on a functional communication system. And I'm happy to engage in questions about that if folks want to talk about that. But I want to get through a couple more slides and then I'll stop for questions, okay? And then what are some of the other factors, medical, schedule, stuff going on at home, hunger, tiredness, um, uh, all kinds of issues. Sleep. One of my doctoral students is doing some research on sleep. And one of the, this is kind of research that this wasn't her study, but one of the studies she reported was that there's a high correlation between having a bad night of sleep and challenging behavior. And I just wanted to say, duh, like I could have told you that, because I know there's a high correlation on my part of having a bad night of sleep and myself engaging in challenging behavior. I may not hit anybody, but I may be snippy to someone who I should not be snippy to. And so, students are people too. And so just something to think about. Okay, so what's an advantage of an interview? So the advantage is that it gives you lots of potential information. It provides information about setting events. It involves members of the team. It provides really great resources and ideas for a positive behavior support plan. The disadvantages is that it's really time consuming. I was talking to someone and a BCBA who has a caseload of 40, she's not going to be able to do hour-long interviews with to develop an FBA. She just doesn't have time. So what's the, what can you do instead of that? Sometimes the information may not be reliable, or it may be I'd like to think of it as being very context specific. So yeah, that may be what happens at home, but it's not what happens at school. Or it may be what happens at school, but it doesn't, doesn't apply to home, or it happens in reading class, but it doesn't happen in PE, so so sometimes interviews can be very context specific, or the information from them can be very context specific. So this is my favorite way to collect data about challenging behaviors. And, that's what kind of geeky lady I am, is that I have a favorite kind of data sheet. But this is called a scatter plot. And the idea of a scatter plot is it allows you to, I'm going to actually just go ahead and show you the filled in one, because it's easier to explain when you're actually looking at it filled in. Maybe I'm going to do that. So a scatter plot allows you to look at the schedule of the day and figure out when the child is engaging in the challenging behavior. So I prefer not to put times here, but I actually prefer to put activities here: arrival, opening circle, centers, math, reading, whatever the activity is. And then what you can do here is you look at the different days, and then if it's 0 times, it's just blank. If it's 1 time, you put a slash one way. If it's 2 happens again, you put a slash the other way. And if it's more than 3, you fill it in. Now, there's some bad things about this. So I don't know if on 9/13 between 8 and 8:20, this child engaged in this behavior 4 times or 14 times. I don't know that, okay, which is a problem. But more than 4 or more times is still problematic, right? So, but you can get some nice information here. So something's happening here at arrival, right? And is it the transition into the room? Is it because the child's just been on the bus for an hour and now I'm asking them to sit down for another 20 minutes without, a break? Whatever it is, there's something that's going on here. The rest of the day is not really bad, but boy, this arrival time, I need to think about what's happening here. I also need to think about what's happening during 8:20 to 8:35 and 9:20 to 9:35, because the behavior never happens then. Okay. So the fact that the behavior I have times when the behavior never happens, helps me be a good detective and say, what's happening during those times? And is it that is it a more child directed time? Is it one-on-one time? Is it time where the child is eating? Maybe the kid's hungry. I don't know. So, but it gives me something to build on. So when I think about a scatter plot, it's an interval recording system that assists you in determining the pattern of the behavior. So some advantages is that it pinpoints the time in which the behavior is likely or less or unlikely to occur. It's super quick. It's really, it does assist in identifying functions, because you can say what's going on in the classroom or in the child's life during that time. The disadvantages is it doesn't tell you anything about immediate antecedents or consequences. And it doesn't give me any information about things I've tried before. Whereas in an interview, someone can tell me, well, we tried this intervention and we tried that intervention and this and that. It also doesn't tell me anything about those unseen setting events that we know are super important as we welcome children back to school. Okay, that's what it looks like. And then another way of collecting data for our functional behavior assessment is what we call an ABC analysis. Now, again, ABC means the antecedent, what happens before the behavior itself, and the consequence, what happens after the behavior. And an ABC analysis is an event recording system. And what that means is that every time an event happens, we record information about it that determines what happens before and after the target behavior. An advantage is that it gives us that pinpoint time data about immediate antecedents and consequences. It can help us confirm a hypothesis, which is super helpful. Some disadvantages is that we don't know anything about unseen setting events, which again can be super important. And I think sometimes people don't like to use the ABC analysis because they say, well, they leave out all that important stuff. And yes, they do if that's the only tool you use. But an ABC analysis augmented by an interview can be super helpful. And then they can be time consuming. But here's an example of an ABC analysis. So this happens when William has to wait for the bus and he's presented with a difficult task. He screams and swings his arms. Mom asks him to mom asks him to stop doing the task. And so what do we think the purpose of that behavior was? Is that he got to escape. Now, I'm not quite sure why he was asked for be presented with a difficult task when he was waiting for the bus, but there's a different issue. Okay, so this happens when Maggie has been working independently on her independent work. She wanders the classroom, shoving the materials of her classmates on the floor. I bet some of us have a Maggie in our classroom. The teacher walks over to her to redirect her work. And again, why do we think Maggie's engaging in that behavior? We think it's for attention. Here's another example. After a weekend with his grandparents, and when asked to go to reading groups, Quintelis puts his head down and begins to doodle on the paper. And the teacher assistant lets him doodle. And so he gets to escape having to read. Okay. So here's a couple more examples with Eric. So when Eric sees the stairs outside, he hits the door leading to the outside. Mom opens the door so he can go up the stairs. And so hitting the door he's trying to obtain access. Presented with a less preferred toy after working, he screams and pushes the toy off the table. And the teacher gives him access to a more preferred toy. And so he engages in that behavior for a tangible reason. But again, remember I said, if a student does not have a functional communication system, here would be a great time when we would need to teach Eric to say, no, thank you. I want X. Okay. And again, if a student doesn't know how to do that, we're going to see these behaviors. When prevented from gaining access to a preferred item, Eric drops to the floor. The teacher gives him his preferred item. And again, he's trying to obtain access. So, okay. So I'm going to do one more slide. Then I'm going to ask for questions, and then we're going to do a case study. Okay. So when we think about developing a hypothesis statement, we want the hypothesis statement so that we can determine what we think the function of the behavior is. And we want to review the data to identify under what behavior does the behavior occur, what happens when the behavior occur, and we summarize when X happens, S engages in problem behaviors to get Y. Okay, so when in this situation, in this context, the child engages in a problem behavior to get attention, or when it's math time, Annie engages in destruction and material destruction to get to escape math. Okay, so that's kind of what we're trying to do. So I'm going to stop my sharing here just for a minute and see if there are any questions. Does anyone have any questions? Nope. Okay. Thank you for answering that question. I appreciate that. I'm going to wait one more minute to see if anyone does. You can also put them in the chat if you have questions. Could you give some examples of tier 1 functional communication systems? So Christina, that's a great question. And I would argue that functional communication systems tend not to be tier 1 because we assume that most children learn those basic communication skills without direct instruction. However, I think that there are some visual supports that people put into the classrooms to help children with emotional words or with words, calming words that might be kind of class-wide examples of tier of functional communication systems. But when I think about a functional communication system, I'm really thinking about a child who has a quantitative and qualitative impairment in how they've learned language. And so that is probably not going to be a tier 1 system. But that's a great question. But I do think, I'm not sure who it was, if it was Rena Marie or Cassie, who talked about kind of self-management and self-assessment. And there are some good visuals, and I know they shared some of those with you about, how to use those in a class-wide basis. And the CASEL website has some great visuals as well. But on an individual student basis, that would be a more SDI, specially designed instruction kind of thing.
That might also be an opportunity to collaborate with your speech and language pathologist that you have
Absolutely.
around, and encourage that teaming in the classroom with all students.
Mm-hmm. Great point. It's also one of the things, it's also an issue that we want to think about for students who are English language learners, because although students may have academic language, they may not have some of the emotional language in English, so I think that's one of the reasons that we like visuals so much, that because so many of us use them, and with Boardmaker, when you make visuals, you can write words in more than one language on them. And so if you have students who are bilingual, or staff members who are bilingual, or families who are bilingual, it's kind of a nice way to share information with them. So, okay, any other questions? Okay, I'm going to go back to my screen. Okay, so we're going to talk about Annie here.
Eileen, I think it's sharing the presentation view rather than the actual presentation. So this is like the presenter view.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Is it still doing that?
Yeah, it is.
Okay. When in doubt, hit escape. Start over. Okay. I don't know why it was doing that, but here we go again. How about now?
Yep, that's great.
Okay, thank you. Okay, okay. So Annie is a 7-year-old. She is in a classroom with students of a variety of disabilities, and including typically developing kids. Annie was diagnosed with autism at 2.5. She has limited verbal skills, but she will use she will say, "I want whatever" to request things. She loves to fidget. She likes to listen to music. She likes to verbally label pictures and look at books during academic times. She has demonstrated significant challenging behaviors with elopement, leaving the designated area, and material destruction. Annie lives at home with 3 sisters, mother and father. Her parents speak Vietnamese at home, but parents and sisters are bilingual. Her mother drives her to school, and Annie has been demonstrating because Annie has been her mom drives her to school because Annie has been disruptive on the bus. And her mom reports that she's seen some similar behaviors at home, but not with the same intensity. Okay. So let's think about why Annie. So let's think about what we're going to do for Annie. So the first thing that we're going to do for Annie is think about what the behavior is, right? So she engages in this disruptive behavior, and the disruptive behavior includes material disruption and elopement, so leaving the designated area. And so from the interview, we know that we have some ideas of why Annie engages in this behavior. When she sees an item that she wants, that's what her parents say, is that when she sees an item that she wants, she just goes for it. She doesn't think about, well, I'm in a different activity now. I'm doing something different. Okay. Her teachers say she does it. So her teachers say that she does it for to get things for tangible reasons. The SLP says that it's to get attention from her father, and it'd be nice if I was better with pronouns. And the SLP also says to avoid non-preferred food, which is interesting, but kind of not what we were thinking about. So it's interesting here because this is one of the problems with interviews, is that people tell us all different things. So like here we say, okay, we have something that is a tangible, we have a behavior that's tangible. We have a behavior that is escape, attention, and escape. So, we're that doesn't help us all that much, but maybe when we see a scatter plot, it might help a little bit more. So again, let's look at the scatter plot. So we know that independent work is a super hard time. Circle is a moderately hard time, as is arrival is a moderately hard time. And the afternoon is better. Okay. It's not easy because this is a pretty high rate of behavior, but it's better. But this independent work time is probably where I would start my work. Okay. What we see is that when does this happen? When Annie is playing alone, the teacher comes over, when the teacher comes over and asks, and Annie begins to bang her knee or head with a toy, And so we think that that's attention. When Annie has been working independently, she begins to scream to obtain attention. At circle, she bangs her knee on the floor. The teacher puts her hand on her knee and sits with her to obtain attention. Okay, so the ABC form leads us to believe that this is attention based. So our hypothesis statement is that given activities with little attention, Annie will hit her her head, sorry about that, to gain attention of family members and teachers. So let's think about changing antecedents, okay? And I just want to encourage you to, when you receive your book, the Flexible and Focused book, on chapter 9 of that book, they talk about changing antecedents. So that's a good resource for you, okay? So remember, when we change antecedents, we want to think about those things that happen before the behavior occurs. So we're trying to give Annie, in this case, a different alternative, okay, to engage in, rather than when I want attention, I'm going to engage in this challenging behavior. So we're going to teach an alternative behavior. So let's think about what are the SEL skills that we could be teaching her here. We could be teaching her an idea. We could be teaching her to manage her own behavior. We could be teaching her to be aware of the environment around her. We could be teaching her good communication skills. There are all kinds of things from our SEL list of things we could be teaching her. We could be teaching her to ask for help, to engage in a conversation with someone if she wants attention. We could be teaching her how to ask for a break. Doesn't really need a break, but what she might need is help or attention. We could be also working on that functional communication skill. So we could provide an incompatible behavior. So this behavior happens when she's working independently. So one thing we could do is we could assign some children to work by themselves and some children to work in pairs. So there may be other children in the classroom who would also prefer to work in teams. This might be a time when we could have someone engage in peer tutoring with Annie. Or she could be working on a collaborative skill with someone else. This might be a time as well where a child from a different grade could even come in and do some cross-age tutoring with her during that independent work time. We could provide non-contingent access to a preferred material or activity. So Annie seems to like attention. And so perhaps what we do is we have a schedule for Annie. If the independent work time is 20 minutes, maybe every 5 minutes, Annie, regardless of what's going on, because non-contingent means this happens based on the clock, not based on the behavior, right? So contingent means that when you finish your work, I will pay attention to you. Okay, that's my behavior or a reinforcer or something, a stimulus based on the behavior you're engaged in. Non-contingent means that at 12 o'clock, regardless of what's going on, you're going to get attention. Okay, so we could provide some non-contingent access to material. So we may just say, set a timer for her, do this for 5 minutes, and then you get to do your choice for 5 minutes. She works on the teacher task for 5 minutes. And then the last 5 minutes of independent work time is she's doing an Annie chosen task. We could think about using schedules. So it might be, and again, if you look at chapter 6 of Flexible and Focus, there's some really good activities and materials and visuals in there about schedules. One of the things that I think is really hard for some children is understanding how long you're going to be engaged in any one activity. How long is this going on? And so a schedule, sometimes with or without timers, can be helpful. So knowing that in this independent work time, you need to do a math worksheet and a reading worksheet and one manipulative, and then you're done. And then you get to do an Annie selected activity. Visual supports can also help make that happen. And then the last thing that I always think about whenever I'm changing antecedents for anyone, is that I like this idea of trying to make the abstract concrete. So for children who have communication issues, whether they are English language learners or they're kids with intellectual disabilities, or they're children who are really impulsive so that they don't listen. They have a hard time listening to a long list of directions. I like to, there's so many abstractions in a day, in a classroom in a day, that I like to say, okay, here's what's happening. Here are the bullet points. This is happening. This is happening. This is happening. And how do I make that really abstract idea of the day very concrete for a learner? And however I can do that, I do it. And whether it's a schedule with pictures or with words, or for a more sophisticated learner, it may be on their laptop or their iPad. Some people actually will use smartwatches for kids that have timers on them, that, or there's something called a motivator that basically you can program it and it will beep at, on schedule. So every 10-minute it beeps and I can say, how am I doing? Where am I doing? What am I supposed to be doing now? That's kind of a really nice thing. There's so many apps now for a smartphone or an iPad that do that. It's kind of saying, are you on task? And those may be a really helpful kind of attention strategy for this. For a child who's having issue with this, a self-management schedule may be super helpful. And we know that self-management can be taught with very young children. So that is something that might be a good way to think about an antecedent change for Annie. Another antecedent change for Annie can be a behavioral contract. So, okay, Annie, if here's what we're going to do. I need you to, during independent work time, do these 3 things. And when you do those 3 things, at the end of that, then you have access to a preferred activity. Music. Sometimes it can be, ideally you can say you get to do something special with a peer, which is a nice way to build peer relationships. You can choose the next song we're going to sing if that's a reinforcer to you. You can go out early for recess if that's a reinforcer to you. Think about what could be on the behavioral contract. You can play with a flashlight if that's a reinforcer to you. They don't have to be fancy things. I know that we used to just go, you can go for a walk and you can choose a peer to go for a walk with and a teacher if you want. We can also think about contingent use of positive reinforcement. So I can be using behavior specific praise during the independent work time. So behavior specific praise is very important, because one of the things that it does for us is it reminds us that we're working on behavior. We're not talking about children being good or bad children. Children are always good. Behaviors may be good or bad, but we don't think about children that way. We think about behaviors that way. And so when we use behavior specific praise, we're like, hey, you're doing a super job writing those numbers on your math worksheet. That's great. Number 1, number 2, and number 3 are done and correct. Awesome. Okay. Not good girl. Right. That's not behavior specific praise. Whenever we provide praise, we want to make sure it's really specifying the behavior the child is engaging in. And then we could have a contingent removal of preferred materials. So, you know what? You really love playing on your iPad or, but sorry, you don't get to do that now because you didn't finish your work. And I don't like to do that kind of thing, but people use it all the time. And the number one example of that is removing recess. So that's, of course, assuming that recess is preferred. But I know after you all heard Carla Landis yesterday talk about the importance of movement, none of us would ever think about removing recess, but we see that happen all the time. And the problem with contingent removal of a preferred material, which is a mild form of punishment, but the problem with it is it doesn't teach Annie the right thing to do. So you don't learn. The way you learn the right thing to do is by changing the antecedents. Punishing someone or removing a privilege doesn't teach a child the right thing to do. And so it almost is it's hard, sometimes you can say it's necessary to do that, but all that may do is provide a short period where it may be more possible to do intervention. Okay. So let's think about what we could do specifically for Annie. Okay. So we're going to have a special bag of activities, toys, snacks that she can access during low attention time. We don't know that she, is hungry. She might be. That'd be interesting to know. But she has a special bag of things at her, a work box or bag that she can have at her workstation during when she's supposed to be working independently. If the goal is, I don't care what she's doing, I just want her to be engaged in something, that might be something to do. We want to use differential reinforcement. And differential reinforcement is the idea of catching kids being good, catching kids engaging in the behavior that we want to see. Okay. We want to teach Annie how to ask for attention. How am I doing? How's this look? And we want to teach her how to do that, because right now the only way she knows how to get attention is by engaging in challenging behavior and getting out of her seat and things like that. So, and we want to go ahead. Oh, okay. And we want to teach her how to self-manage and engage in self-assessment. Those are all antecedents. In terms of consequences, we want to think about positive reinforcement. So if she gets special time with the teacher, let's not make that when she gets out of her seat. Let's make that contingent on appropriate behavior. And then when she does engage in challenging behavior, like getting out of her seat and things, let's redirect her back in the most seamless and way possible with the least amount of attention. So questions or comments about that? I know there's a lot of information there.
Okay, I found that
some of these things were extremely hard to do when you had half your class with you and half your class online. And even when we were all online, it was still hard to do positive praise because you couldn't see, they weren't showing the work necessarily unless
Right.
you do it like on a whiteboard and everyone show the teacher and you're like, yes, you got it, and with their name. But it was extremely hard to try to use some of these things in our situation. And now with them coming back after missing a year of being in a classroom full time, we may have to go back to a lot of these things to reteach it. I'm feeling, that's what I'm feeling.
I think you are absolutely right. And, I think that one of the things that I would assume that we will do that, because, what I don't think we want people to do is to come in and fail and then go back and reteach. I think that we're going to have to come back in and say, welcome to school, and let's go through all of the routines and what it means to be in this classroom. Let's learn the routines. And even if you think, well, I taught them once, yeah, but you haven't done it in a year. So, and there are some kids that probably never did it. So let's go back and think about um, uh, teaching every routine. How do we come in and sit down? How do we enter? And hopefully they'll learn it really quickly. But for some children, it might take a little longer, and I think that's where visuals will be super helpful in doing that. This is how we turn homework in. This is what we do if we're done with work early. This is, every route. This is what we do if we need help, you know. Um, so, but I agree with you. I think we're going to absolutely have to be reteaching routines.
Well, and I would hope that we would present to our principal that we need to be allowed that time to do that it's going to benefit us in the long run if we don't give ourselves that time and have grace to do that time before we get right into the academics type of thing. And sometimes people won't ask for it.
Yeah.
So I think we have to be bold and say, please give us, at least 3 weeks. 4 would be fantastic, just to build our community and establish our new routines. But yeah, asking for it is hard for some people.
Yeah. And I think too that it doesn't mean while you're teaching routines that you're not doing content. It may be that because you have to teach the routine, you have to have some context in which you teach the routine, right? So but you may be doing more time on the social emotional and the routine building and a little less time on content, but you're still making progress on content. And I think that that idea that they need to be integrated is really important. So I just want to react to a question that Deborah brought up about using extinction with a child that is aggressive. So, the idea of extinction or the definition of extinction is that you're removing reinforcement from a behavior that has previously been reinforced. So, the classic example is I'm in we're in a checkout line at the supermarket, and it's like, I want candy, I want candy, I want candy. And, every time in the past, you've always given them candy. And this time you say, I'm not going to reinforce this time. And so sometimes you might get a little extinction burst, the child engages in more asking for candy. And then finally it will go away if you reinforce other behaviors. The problem with extinction, though, is 2 things. One is that you will get an extinction burst. And the other is that because you're removing reinforcement, unless you have another behavior in place, it may look to people like you're ignoring that behavior. I would never ignore a behavior where one child is hitting another child, just because, we have a 0 tolerance for that. You can't hit your peers. Even if as a behavior analyst and looking at the function of behavior, I say, well, the best behavior, the best strategy here would, theoretically would be removing all attention and using extinction. I can't do that in a classroom because it's not fair to the other children, because everyone has a right to be safe at school. So I would be very careful to think about, if I have a child who is hitting other kids during that when they're bored or trying to avoid a task. One thing that I might try to do is see if I could figure out how long they go before they engage in that behavior, and make sure that I'm reinforcing them. Like if they go 5 minutes between, before they engage in that behavior, then say, okay, every 3 minutes I'm going to reinforce them, or again, have that bag of preferred materials, or have them have a fail-safe way to get your attention, because again, hitting another peer is a fail-safe way to get your attention, because teachers don't ignore that. So, but we always want to think about how an intervention that we do for one child will affect everyone else and affect the context of our community. Okay, I'm going to move on. Oops, I better go back to sharing. Okay, are you seeing the right thing there? Okay, thank you. Okay, so now let's try to connect the dots. Okay, so so we've talked about PBIS, we've talked about changing challenging behaviors, we've talked about SEL skills, and I want to just kind of think about how those SEL skills, which are important in and of themselves, but also how, when we are writing FBAs or BIPs, behavior intervention plans, or thinking about challenging behaviors, how we can integrate those SEL skills into them so that they're not separate, they're part of. Because if we can't make SEL work part of what we do on a daily basis, then we won't sustain it, right? What we know about innovation is that we need to make sure that we integrate it into the ongoing core of what goes on in the classroom. So what I did, and again, there are many, any one of us could have written this slide and highlighted different things. But what I did is I went through the core SEL competencies and said, so what are some ways that I could use some of the the social emotional learning skills and think about them when I'm writing, when I'm thinking about some of my students who engage in challenging behaviors. So I started with self-awareness. So I don't know how many of you know that the How Is My Engine Running? I think it's called the Impact. I forget what the name of the program is.
Yeah.
Do you know,
Alert,
Marie?
alert program. Yeah, we'll put the link in.
Yeah. So the Alert program, which is a really great program, but the idea is that it teaches it's often run by occupational therapists. It was started by occupational therapists in New Mexico, and but it teaches children to think about, how is your engine, your body as an engine, and how is your engine running? Is it too slow? Is it just right? Or is it too fast? And I've seen hundreds of knockoffs of this, are you in the blue zone or the red zone or the green zone? Are you in a red light, green light, yellow light? Hundreds of different kinds of manipulations of it, but it all really came from this Alert program out of New Mexico. Well, that's social emotional learning, right? That's awareness. how am I feeling? And then what do I need to do to change that? So if my engine is running too fast, what do I need to do to slow it down? Okay. If my engine is running too slow, what do I need to perk it up? And if my engine is running just right, how do I look around and say, okay, my engine is running just right. So how do I recreate this tomorrow? Okay. That's one idea. The other is, do I need a break? Okay. So that's part of the, is my engine running too fast? But also, if I need a break because it's too loud, it's too hard, I'm tired, what do I need? That's another thing that you could be doing that's, again, under self awareness. And another self awareness is, do I need help? Is this too hard? Is this too easy? Is everything okay? Um, and so, and how do I move from there? Okay, the next social emotional learning core competency of self-management. And so, again, how do I calm down? So what can I do to calm myself down? What can I do? How do I use my schedule to orient myself to what I need to do? And how can I use visuals to communicate more clearly? So it would all be strategies under self-management. Another way of self-management is taking data on yourself. And we know that that's taking data on yourself is one of the very best way to change your behavior. Anytime you start any kind of behavior change routine as an adult, whether it's trying to increase your exercise or decrease your amount of calories that you eat or whatever it is, one of the first things they have you do is take data. If you want to drink more water every day, how many, you need to count how many cups of water am I drinking during the day. So that idea of self-management, again, is something that we can be teaching children early on. Okay, the next one that I think we overlook and don't teach enough is social awareness. So how can we teach students to make positive comments about each other's work? So I didn't use the word compliment here, because I wanted to be more specific and say we can teach children how to use behavior specific praise with each other. Like, I like the way you use it. I really like your picture because it has a lot of green in it. And green is my favorite color. Okay. So it's not perfect behavior specific praise or so instead of saying that's a cool thing out of Play-Doh, saying, I like that your Play-Doh thing has 4 legs. So we can teach children to be socially aware of other children by making behavior specific praise. It's also a nice way to comment on what other children are doing. The next one I want to talk about is relationship skills. And what we know, and especially in classrooms where we have children of mixed abilities, is that we have over 50 years of data now to tell us that if we have classrooms of children of mixed abilities and we don't do anything systematically to teach children to interact, that we'll have these groups of mixed abilities, children of mixed abilities who don't interact. And so it goes to show us that being there is not enough, and so there's all kinds of things that you can do. One of my favorite is something called Buddy Day. And I think maybe Rena Marie actually developed this program. And if not, I'm still giving her credit for it. But when she taught kindergarten. But the idea of Buddy Day is that you, in a classroom, you have some days where you just assign kids to be buddies, and they can do things like when you dismiss kids to go out to recess, you dismiss that pair of buddies together. Or you might do a buddy art project where instead of everyone getting an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper, the kids get 11, two kids get a 11 by 17 sheet of paper to work on something together. Or you might have a time where everyone's working on board games, or they're doing some peer tutoring, but you're basically encouraging kids to interact with each other. And then you're giving kids feedback on the fact of, hey, you're being a super buddy today because you're helping this child solve a problem. Or I like the way that you two are talking in a nice inside classroom voice. Or, so you're giving children an opportunity to engage in the behavior, and then you're teaching them how to engage in that behavior, and then you're providing them with behavior specific praise about engaging in that behavior. Another thing that I think is important is that you have time for planned social interactions. So, we know that when we often talk about how budgets talk about our priorities, and in classrooms, we can talk about how time budgets reflect our priorities. So if you don't budget any time for planned social interactions, then it's not a priority. So how do we have time for children to work or play together in a group? Another thing I think is super important to do is to teach persistence. In the developmental literature, we know that 50% of children's bids for attention are ignored. And so we need to teach kids to be persistent. If someone doesn't pay attention to you the first time, how do I persist in an appropriate way? How do I correct or my communicative attempt? How do I mend it so that it may be more understandable the next time? And then the final one, which I think is a kind of an interesting idea, and I included the link there, is that there's this process called social autopsies about that goes under that I think is a great idea for responsible decision making. That once and this is done when you've had a less than successful social interaction, and you can go back the next day or some hours after the challenge is over, and teach children to say, so what went wrong there? What could I have done better? Now, the important thing about that is that you need to do that with children who have the cognitive ability to do that, cognitive and language ability to do that. And two is that, as my husband always reminds me, whether you're, 5 or 65, you cannot learn anything when you're in the middle of a tantrum. You are not available for instruction. You're available for instruction before the tantrum occurs, and you're available for challenging behavior, and you're available for instruction after you've reached equilibrium again. But you cannot teach. People are not available for teaching in the middle of a event. So you have to think about when in the cycle of challenging behavior do you do that social autopsy. But I think there's a really nice, that website has a really nice information about how you can do it. And actually that Okali website has some really nice modules about other evidence-based practices as well. So at that, I want to open it up to you for any comments or reflections or ideas that you might have. I'm just going to go quickly to this last slide, just because in case I know you've probably gotten this 100 times, but if you need anything from us, here's our website and an email where you can reach us. And we'd be happy to answer any questions. But I'd like to open it up to see if anyone has any questions or comments or anything they want to talk about. Or should we just break early for lunch? So.
Okay.
And make sure you're signed in.
Thank you. I guess my question for our functional assessment that we did on our case study was that the behaviors that were noted were that she's destroying materials and that she likes to elope. But I don't know that the strategies and the information that we gathered had anything to do with those necessarily, just that she was seeking attention and not necessarily looking specifically at those two behaviors.
So that's a great example. That's a great comment, and I think that there are two factors going on here. One is lack of good planning on the part of the presenter. So there's a little bit of a mismatch there. So I'll own that. But the other thing is, I think that there is some real life situation there. Is that sometimes people will say this is the behavior, but then when you actually get in there and start interviewing and observing, it's not the behavior. So, so I think that I'm really happy you noticed that, because I kind of noticed it as I was going through it again today, and I was like, well, this kind of is odd, but I think that you also have to be open-minded and say, I'm not sure, where do I go with this? And so in this case, I would say, I might want to collect some more behavior. So is elopement really the issue, or is elopement happening as an example of attention? Is the material, is it, if I intervened earlier, so is that kind of attention getting behavior happening, and then elopement and material destruction, does that only happen when I don't attend to those low level, almost antecedent behaviors? So those would be things that I would want to gather more information about. But that's a great call.
Great, thank you so
Yeah.
much. That makes total sense there
Yeah.
too. So thank you.
Yeah, and I do think that sometimes that, we do that is, we're like, well, I'm not going to intervene there, but like, I mean, I know people who can say, it's like you hear someone answer in a tone of voice and you say, that's the antecedent to a tantrum. So I'm going to intervene here, and my intervention might be that I'm going to say to the child, start that self-awareness training right there. How's your engine running right now? So and that is helpful. So I see that Lori asks a question. I like the ideas of questions to think about in ask themselves. I thank you for that comment, Lori. I think it's really great to start getting children involved as early as possible in thinking about their own behavior. We want children to be independent and be self advocates, and learn how to advocate for themselves, to say, no, I need it this way, or so I know I do better when I can learn this way. I know I need to sit in the front row. I know, we teach students who have visual impairments do that. I'm sorry, I need different materials. I need this to be large print. And we used to do that when we would print things out, but I need this accommodation in the classroom. But we sometimes don't think about that for the social emotional kinds of behavior or sensory behavior. I've had kids who do really well when they wear a hat in classrooms because they don't like fluorescent lights. And I've had principals say to me, you can't wear a hat in school. And I say, well, you can if it's in the IEP. Let's do a test, let's do a little experiment. Let's do hat on, hat off, hat on, hat off, and see if there's a difference in behavior. And then it's like, okay, if there's a difference in behavior, let's say hat on. Now you can tell me what the hat has to look like. If you want it to be a plain hat with no material on it, that's cool. But, you can always do it if it's on the IEP. So we're going to, I think, we have 4, and Great example, great question, Patricia. And there are the same examples can be applied in general ed. And there are some really good examples around those, and we'll throw some references in there. And great point, Lori, about practicing the skills during a less challenging time. Like you have to practice. So that's why we have fire drills, right? We have fire drills so that we can practice getting out of the building when there's not really a fire. And we should practice these self-management behaviors when there isn't a fire going on as well. So I hope we'll see you all at 1 o'clock. Bethany Maffei, if you were here on Tuesday, you heard her fabulous keynote. And so at 1 o'clock, she's going to lead us in a story slam that is super exciting. And I can't wait for it. So I hope that we'll see you back here at 1 o'clock.
Thank you. This has
You're
been
welcome.
a wonderful
Thank you.
workshop.
Whew. Okay.
Great. Yes. I mean, you can stop recording if you want.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. It was